The SOS got a response. Deathworlders deployed a fleet, and the galaxy watched in awe. The silence of space was broken by the sudden transmission. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a chill down the spine of anyone who happened to hear it. The message was clear, though strange, like a cry for help that had been hidden in the dark corners of the galaxy for far too long. "We need help," the message said, breaking through the static. "We've been invaded by creatures from beyond the stars. They are relentless. Please, someone, anyone, respond." The voice sounded desperate, its tone filled with the kind of fear that only someone who was truly at the end of their rope could have. The message wasn't long, but it carried a heavy weight. It was a plea for survival, a call for someone to come to the aid of those who could not help themselves. The signal came from a small, barely known planet called Tyrannes. Tyrannes had always been on the edge of the known galaxy, a place that few bothered to visit, a world that was forgotten by most. A rocky, desolate planet, it had been left alone for decades. Most of the galaxy had assumed that it was uninhabited, a wasteland with no reason for anyone to care. That was, until this SOS had cut through the dark expanse of space, a signal that shattered the quiet isolation of Tyrannes. On the bridge of the Star Voyager, Captain Will Grant stared at the screen, his face tight with concentration. His fingers hovered over the console, unsure of what to do next. The transmission was strange and unsettling, but it was also clear. Someone somewhere needed help. The people of Earth had always prided themselves on coming to the aid of others, on standing up when things seemed impossible. This was no different. "Captain, are we really going to respond to this?" Lieutenant Chloe Adams asked, her voice calm but filled with a quiet concern. "We don't even know who sent this message. It could be a trap." Will Grant shook his head. "If someone is out there in need, we can't just ignore them. It's our duty to respond." Chloe looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied his face. Will Grant was the kind of leader who took risks, who didn't shy away from a challenge. But this felt different. There was something about the message that didn't sit right with her, something that felt off. But she trusted Grant. He had never led them astray. "We'll need to be cautious," she said, her fingers already moving over the control panel. "We don't know what we're walking into." Will nodded. "I know, but we don't have time to waste. Let's see what's going on out there." The decision was made. With a course set for Tyrannes, the Star Voyager began its journey toward the mysterious planet. The ship's engines hummed quietly as it cut through the darkness, heading into the unknown. The crew moved with purpose, preparing for whatever awaited them. As they approached the planet, the view on the screen changed. The once quiet world now seemed far more dangerous. The planet's surface was covered with massive, blackened craters, and the sky above it was filled with the smoldering remnants of what had once been a thriving colony. What had happened here? The answer seemed just out of reach, like a riddle that begged to be solved. "Captain," Chloe's voice came through, breaking the tense silence. "I'm picking up strange readings. There's something out there, something big." Will's eyes flicked to the screen as Chloe zoomed in on the planet's surface. There, hovering in the atmosphere, was a massive structure. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before, a fortress in the sky, with sharp, jagged edges and enormous walls that seemed to pulse with energy. It looked like something out of a nightmare. "What is that?" Chloe whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "I don't know," Will replied, his voice low, "but we're going to find out." As they approached the planet's orbit, the Star Voyager's sensors picked up more unusual activity. Hundreds of smaller ships, some barely visible, were scattered across the surface, darting in and out of the planet's atmosphere. They looked like nothing the crew had ever seen before. The shapes were irregular, with sharp angles and smooth, metallic surfaces that seemed to shimmer in the light. The ships appeared to be moving in a coordinated fashion, like a swarm of insects descending on their prey. "Looks like we're not the only ones here," Chloe said. "Those ships, they're not human." Will felt his pulse quicken. It was the unmistakable feeling of something bad coming their way, a threat that they weren't prepared for. But they had no choice but to press forward. The message had been clear: someone on the planet needed help. And that was enough for Will Grant to make the decision to go in, no matter what they were facing. "Let's get closer," he ordered. "We'll take a closer look and figure out what's happening down there." The Star Voyager moved steadily closer to the planet, weaving through the ships and debris in the atmosphere. As they got closer to the surface, the crew could see the destruction more clearly. Buildings that had once been full of life were now reduced to rubble, and the air was thick with smoke and ash. It was a world in chaos, and they had arrived just as the storm was reaching its peak. Suddenly, the ship shuddered as something struck it. The alarms blared and the lights flickered. Will's heart raced as he tried to steady himself. "What was that?" Chloe shouted, her fingers flying over the controls. "Something just hit us," Will said, his voice firm. "We need to get out of here." But just as quickly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The ship was intact, but something else had changed. A new signal had appeared on the sensors, one that was unlike anything they had ever encountered. "This is strange," Chloe said, her brow furrowing. "There's a fleet coming. It's huge, Captain." Will stood up, his eyes locked on the screen. The fleet was massive, moving toward them at incredible speed. It wasn't just one ship, it was an entire armada, and it wasn't from Earth. There were no markings that the crew recognized, no flags that belonged to any known civilization. This fleet was alien, and it was headed straight for them. "Who are they?" Chloe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Will replied, feeling the weight of the moment. "But we're about to find out." The fleet appeared like a dark storm on the horizon, massive ships with jagged edges and eerie glowing lights. They moved in perfect formation, an intimidating sight that sent a shiver down Will's spine. It wasn't just a group of ships. It was an army, one that had come from the unknown to answer the call of the SOS. And then the realization hit Will like a freight train. These weren't just any ships. They weren't here to attack. They were here to save. The fleet that was descending upon Tyrannes was not just any force. It was a force that had been called in to answer the desperate cry for help. The Deathworlders had arrived. "Get ready, everyone," Will said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "This is it, the response we've been waiting for. The galaxy is about to watch in awe." As the Deathworlders' fleet neared, the crew of the Star Voyager braced themselves for the unknown. They didn't know who these alien beings were or what they had planned, but one thing was certain. The answer to the SOS had arrived, and it was bigger than anything they could have imagined. The massive fleet of ships moved steadily toward Tyrannes, their dark silhouettes becoming clearer against the dim backdrop of space. Will Grant, captain of the Star Voyager, stood at the command center, his eyes locked on the screen. The unknown fleet was unlike anything they had ever seen. Their ships were sharp-edged, sleek, and covered in strange, glowing symbols that flickered in the cold light of space. Will's heart beat faster as the realization hit him. "We've got company," he muttered under his breath. Lieutenant Chloe Adams was at his side, her fingers moving quickly over the controls. "They're coming in fast, Captain. There's no way we can outrun them." "We're not going to outrun them," Will said, his voice firm. "We're going to find out who they are and why they're here." The fleet continued to approach with a terrifying precision. The ships seemed to move as one, coordinated and flawless in their formation. They weren't here to attack, at least not yet. But what were they here for? And who were these Deathworlders that had come in response to the SOS? On the ground, things were no better. The planet's surface was still smoldering from the Zetar's assault. Buildings were nothing but ruins, and the air was thick with smoke. But now there was a glimmer of hope. The Zetar forces, though numerous, were scattered and confused. Their insectoid forms scurried about, trying to regroup, but the Deathworlder fleet was already sweeping across the skies. The Zetar had been a constant threat, a deadly force that had swept across planets and civilizations, leaving destruction in their wake. Their invasion of Tyrannes had been brutal, but now, with the arrival of the Deathworlders, things were about to change. Chloe studied the data on the screen. "Captain, they're making their move. The Deathworlder ships are entering the atmosphere." Will nodded. "Get us as close to the surface as possible. We need to help the survivors down there." Chloe moved quickly, adjusting their trajectory. The Star Voyager descended, carefully maneuvering through the growing chaos below. The Deathworlder fleet had already begun their assault on the Zetar forces. Their ships moved with an unnatural speed, attacking from all angles, their weapons firing with deadly accuracy. The Zetar had no chance. As the Star Voyager neared the surface, Will could see flashes of energy lighting up the sky. The Deathworlder ships unleashed powerful beams of concentrated energy that tore through the Zetar ships, reducing them to smoldering wreckage in seconds. The Zetar were tough, but the Deathworlders were something else entirely. Their technology was far beyond anything the humans had ever seen. "We need to land," Will said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "We've got people down there who need us." The ship landed with a soft thud, the engines humming as the doors opened. Will led the way, with Chloe close behind. They stepped out onto the charred soil of Tyrannes, taking in the devastation around them. The once thriving colony was now little more than a wasteland. The survivors they had hoped to find were scattered across the broken landscape, seeking shelter wherever they could. "We're here to help," Will called out, his voice carrying across the empty expanse. A few survivors appeared from behind the ruins, their faces gaunt and weary, but their eyes filled with hope. Among them was a woman who stepped forward, her expression a mix of disbelief and relief. "You're here to help?" she asked, her voice shaky but strong. "You actually came?" Will nodded. "We're here, and we've got more help on the way." The woman's face softened, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. "They're still out there, the Zetar. They won't stop until they've wiped us all out." "We'll make sure that doesn't happen," Will said firmly. "But we need to get you and the others somewhere safe. We've got to move quickly." As the survivors began to gather, Chloe turned to Will. "Captain, look." She pointed toward the sky, where the Deathworlder fleet was making its final assault on the Zetar forces. The large ships swooped down, firing their weapons in perfect coordination. It was like watching a deadly ballet, each movement calculated, each strike devastating. The Zetar had no chance against the sheer force and precision of the Deathworlders. It wasn't just the ships. The Deathworlders themselves, who had arrived on the planet's surface, were unlike anything the humans had ever seen. Their bodies were tall, covered in thick, dark armor that shimmered like the blackness of space itself. They moved with an ease and fluidity that spoke of their power and experience. They didn't need to speak. Their presence alone was enough to instill a sense of awe. Will couldn't help but watch as the Deathworlders wiped out the Zetar forces with terrifying efficiency. There was no hesitation, no mercy, just a cold, calculated response to the threat that had once seemed insurmountable. As the last Zetar ship fell to the ground in a fiery explosion, the survivors on the surface began to cheer. It was a sound that hadn't been heard on Tyrannes in a long time, the sound of victory, the sound of hope. But even as the Deathworlders began to secure the area, Will knew that their work wasn't done. The battle had been won, but there was still much to do. There were still survivors to evacuate, still questions to be answered. One of the Deathworlders, a tall figure with a black helmet and glowing eyes, approached Will. He was the leader of the fleet, his presence even more imposing up close. "You have done well," the Deathworlder said, his voice deep and resonant. "The Zetar will not trouble this world again." Will nodded, but there was a sense of unease in his chest. "Thank you for your help, but why did you respond to our SOS? Why did you come?" The Deathworlder leader's glowing eyes seemed to look right through him. "We have seen the destruction of your people, Captain Grant. We know what it means to fight against a force that will not relent. We also know what it means to survive when everything is against you. You called for help, we answered." Will stood there for a moment, taking in the weight of the Deathworlder's words. He had known that this was more than just a rescue mission. This was a turning point for humanity, a moment where they had earned the attention and respect of a race that was both feared and admired across the galaxy. "We are in your debt," Will said finally. "If there's anything we can do to repay you." The Deathworlder leader cut him off with a simple gesture. "We ask for nothing, but remember this, you are not alone in this galaxy. There are others who will come when called. When you need us, we will be there." With that, the Deathworlder leader turned and signaled to his fleet. The massive ships began to ascend into the sky, disappearing into the void from which they had come. Their mission complete, their purpose fulfilled. The galaxy had witnessed the arrival of the Deathworlders, and they would never forget the awe-inspiring sight. As the dust settled on Tyrannes, Will Grant looked at the survivors around him. They were free now, thanks to the Deathworlders' intervention. But even as they began to rebuild, Will knew that this was only the beginning. The galaxy was changing, and humanity had a new place in it. For the first time in a long while, the stars didn't feel so distant. The day after the battle, Tyrannes felt different. The heavy smoke that had once blanketed the sky was beginning to clear, and sunlight pierced through the clouds, lighting up the surface of the planet for the first time in what seemed like years. The survivors were slowly emerging from the ruins, their faces a mix of disbelief and gratitude. They had been saved, but now they faced the daunting task of rebuilding. Captain Will Grant and Lieutenant Chloe Adams stood near the edge of the Star Voyager, watching as the Deathworlders finished their work. The alien warriors moved with purpose, securing the area, setting up defenses, and making sure there were no Zetar stragglers hiding in the wreckage. Will couldn't help but be amazed at how efficiently they worked. It was as if they had done this 1,000 times before. "Looks like they're not wasting any time," Chloe said, her eyes following the movements of the Deathworlders. "No," Will replied, his voice thoughtful. "They're thorough. They came here to end this fight, and they're making sure it's over for good." The Deathworlder leader, the one who had spoken to Will the day before, approached them. His tall form was imposing, even more so up close. He didn't speak immediately but stood for a moment, observing the work being done. Will and Chloe waited in silence, unsure of what to expect. Finally, the leader spoke. "The Zetar will not return to this world. We have ensured their defeat. However, this is not the end of the story." Will turned to face the leader. "What do you mean?" "I thought the battle was over." "It is," the Deathworlder said. "But the Zetar are not a single force. They are part of a much larger network. The victory here may stop them temporarily, but it will not stop their war across the galaxy. They will seek to regroup, rebuild. And they will strike again." Will felt a sense of unease at the leader's words. The Zetar were dangerous, but what the Deathworlders had done to them on Tyrannis was nothing short of a miracle. The humans had never fought an enemy like that before. The idea that the Zetar could regroup and come back was troubling, especially since Earth and its colonies had no allies to speak of. But the Deathworlders had been more than just helpful. They had been crucial in winning this battle. Could they help again if the Zetar came back? "What should we do?" Chloe asked, voicing the question Will had been thinking. The Deathworlder leader's eyes glowed softly behind his helmet. "The Zetar are a threat not just to this world, but to the entire galaxy. Their reach is vast. Your people are not prepared for what is coming, but there is a way for you to be ready." Will raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? What can we do?" The Deathworlder stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "We will train you. Your soldiers, your leaders, we will teach you how to fight like we do. We will show you how to protect your world and how to strike at the heart of the Zetar if the need arises." Will couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Deathworlders wanted to train Earth's military forces. It seemed like a dream, an opportunity that could change everything. But it also came with a sense of responsibility that he wasn't sure Earth was ready for. "You want us to fight the Zetar?" Will asked. "You think we can handle it?" The leader's glowing eyes softened, though Will knew it wasn't meant to be reassuring. "I do not think, I know. Your people have the strength to survive, but only if you are willing to learn. The Zetar are not invincible. They are driven by hunger, not strategy. But if you want to protect your world, you must become more than just survivors. You must become warriors." Will turned to Chloe, his mind racing. The idea of becoming soldiers in a galactic war seemed overwhelming. But he couldn't ignore the truth in the Deathworlder's words. The Zetar weren't going to stop. Earth had to be ready, or else more worlds would fall. "We'll need time to consider this," Will said, his voice steady. "It's a big decision." The Deathworlder leader nodded. "Take all the time you need. But remember, the galaxy is not a peaceful place. There are many dangers out there. You must decide if you want to be part of the solution or if you want to wait for the next threat to come to your doorstep." With that, the leader turned and walked away, leaving Will and Chloe standing in silence. The words echoed in Will's mind. Was Earth ready to take its place in the galaxy, or would they remain isolated, vulnerable to every danger that came their way? Later that evening, as the sun set over the charred landscape, Will stood alone on the deck of the Star Voyager. The planet was quiet now, the air calm. The fires had stopped burning, and the survivors had begun the long process of recovery. But in his mind, Will couldn't shake the weight of what the Deathworlders had said. "Are we ready for this?" he whispered to himself. Chloe joined him after a few moments, her footsteps light on the metal floor. She stood beside him, looking out at the horizon. "We don't have a choice," she said quietly. "The Zetar are coming for us. We saw what they can do. If we don't act, we'll just be waiting for them to strike again." Will nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant stars. "I know, but can we really become like them? Can we learn how to fight like the Deathworlders?" Chloe's gaze softened. "We don't have to become exactly like them, but we do need to learn how to protect ourselves. We've been lucky so far, but luck doesn't last forever." Will sighed, his shoulders heavy. "I never thought it would come to this. Earth has always been so isolated, so safe." Chloe chuckled lightly. "Safe, maybe, but not anymore. We're part of something bigger now, and we can't just hide away and hope nothing happens. We have to step up." Will turned to face her, a sense of determination in his eyes. You're right, we can't just wait for the next invasion. If we're going to survive, we need to learn how to fight back. And we'll do it together, Chloe said firmly. Will smiled, grateful for her support. They had come a long way since their first mission together, and now they had a new path to follow. A dangerous one, but one that offered the chance to protect their world and maybe even become something greater. The next day, the Deathworlder leader returned, his helmet gleaming in the morning light. Have you made your decision? He asked. Will met his gaze, his voice steady. Yes, we're ready to learn. Teach us how to fight. The leader's eyes flashed with approval. Then prepare yourselves. The training begins tomorrow. You will learn what it takes to stand against the Zetar, and you will become the protectors of your world. With that, the leader turned and walked away. Will felt a new sense of purpose fill him. This was no longer just about surviving. It was about learning, growing, and preparing for whatever was coming next. The galaxy was full of dangers, but now Earth was no longer alone. They had allies, and they had the chance to fight back. And for the first time in a long while, Will felt ready for whatever the future held. The days that followed were unlike anything Will Grant and the crew of the Star Voyager had ever experienced. The training began quickly, and it was harder than anyone had imagined. The Deathworlders had a way of teaching that was direct, intense, and unforgiving. It wasn't just about learning to fight. It was about learning to survive in a universe that was constantly at war. Will had spent most of his career focused on diplomacy, peacekeeping, and leading his crew through missions that were often more about negotiation than battle. But now, as he stood in the training yard with Chloe and the other humans, he realized how little they had known about real combat. Move faster, a Deathworlder instructor barked, his deep voice echoing in the cold air. If you want to survive out there, you need to think quicker than your enemy, react before they do. Will's heart raced as he dodged an incoming strike from the instructor. The Deathworlder was fast, far faster than any human could hope to be, and his blows were calculated, powerful, and precise. Will stumbled, barely managing to keep his feet under him. Chloe, who was nearby, managed to evade another strike, her body moving with more fluidity than Will had expected. She had always been quick, but this level of agility and awareness was something else. It wasn't just physical strength, it was about instinct, something the Deathworlders seemed to have mastered. You're doing better, the instructor said to Chloe, his tone less harsh but still stern. But don't let your guard down. Chloe nodded, sweat dripping from her forehead. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, grinning. This is harder than I thought, but I can handle it. Will, still panting from his own sparring session, shot her a smile. You're doing better than me. The Deathworlders had a way of breaking down their training into steps. First, they taught the humans how to move, how to react quickly and efficiently. Then, they began to teach them about weapons and tactics. The Deathworlders didn't waste time on theory. They didn't want to hear about the politics of war. They focused only on what worked and what would keep you alive. At first, Will had been frustrated. He was used to thinking, planning, analyzing situations from every angle. But the Deathworlders didn't have time for long discussions. They expected quick action, and it wasn't about thinking things through. It was about surviving. Chloe had adapted quicker than Will, and he couldn't help but admire her for it. Her background in fieldwork, her experience in navigating dangerous situations, had given her a strong foundation. Will, on the other hand, had spent more time leading from a command center than on the ground in the middle of the action. It was humbling to realize just how much more there was to learn. After several days of intense training, the humans were ready for the next phase, a live exercise. The Zetar forces had regrouped, and the Deathworlders had discovered their new base of operations on a nearby moon. The humans, though still inexperienced compared to the Deathworlders, were going to join the assault. It would be their first real test. The day of the mission, Will stood with Chloe on the bridge of the Star Voyager, watching the preparations unfold. The crew was ready, but there was still an undercurrent of anxiety running through the ship. This was different from anything they had done before. It wasn't a simple rescue mission. This was a full-on attack. We can do this, Chloe said, breaking the silence between them. Will turned to look at her. I know, but it's one thing to train, and it's another thing to face real danger. Chloe gave him a reassuring smile. We've trained with the best, and we've got them on our side. We can't lose. Will nodded, feeling a sense of pride in her confidence. She was right, they had been trained by the best. The Deathworlders had shown them how to fight and how to think like warriors. They had learned how to defend themselves, how to react under pressure. They had trained for this moment. The Star Voyager was heading to the moon, and the crew was preparing for the fight of their lives. Will watched as the crew members suited up, making final checks on their weapons and equipment. Each of them had a different look in their eyes, but the same determination. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting their world, their people. As the ship entered the moon's atmosphere, the Star Voyager's lights dimmed, and the air inside the ship felt charged with anticipation. Will could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He had to be the leader. He had to keep his crew focused. The mission was straightforward: assault the Zetar base, neutralize their forces, and destroy their ability to regroup. But as Will stood there, staring at the battlefield below, he knew there was more at stake than just the mission. They were fighting for their survival, and they were fighting for the future of Earth. The Star Voyager's landing gear deployed with a soft thud as it touched down on the surface of the moon. The doors opened, and the crew stepped out into the cold, rocky terrain. Will looked around, his eyes scanning the horizon. The moon was desolate, but it was still beautiful in its own way. It was a place where no one had ever truly lived, but it was about to become a battleground. "Stay alert," Will ordered, his voice steady. "We don't know what we're going to find." The crew nodded and began moving toward the Zetar base. They were following the Deathworlders, who led the way, moving silently and efficiently across the rocky landscape. Will's heart raced, but his mind was focused. He couldn't afford to be distracted. There was no time for hesitation. As they approached the base, the sound of battle erupted in the distance. The Deathworlders had already engaged the Zetar forces, and their weapons were firing in perfect sync. The humans had trained for this moment, but nothing could have prepared them for the sight of the battle. It was chaos, explosions lighting up the night sky as the Deathworlders moved through the battlefield like shadows, striking with deadly precision. Will and Chloe followed the Deathworlders, moving in coordinated steps. They had been trained to work together, and now it was time to put that training to the test. The Zetar were fierce, their insected forms darting across the battlefield, firing weapons with relentless speed. But they were no match for the Deathworlders. Will fired his weapon, taking down a Zetar warrior with a well-placed shot. Chloe was close behind, her movements fluid and quick, dispatching enemies with efficiency. The battle raged on, but there was a sense of order to it now. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting as a team. After what felt like hours, the Zetar forces were finally defeated. The moon was quiet again, the only sounds the heavy breathing of the humans and the distant hum of the Deathworlder ships. Will looked around at his crew, each of them exhausted but proud. They had done it. They had faced their first real battle and come out victorious. The Deathworlder leader approached Will, his helmet still on but his voice filled with approval. "You fought well. Your people have the strength to survive." Will smiled, feeling a sense of pride he had never known before. "We couldn't have done it without you." The Deathworlder nodded. "Remember, this is only the beginning. There will be more battles ahead. But you now have the skills to face them." As the crew of the Star Voyager stood in the aftermath of the battle, they realized something. They were no longer just survivors. They were fighters, warriors ready to defend their world and their future. The galaxy had opened up to them in a way they had never expected, and they had proven they were ready for the challenges that lay ahead. The mission was over, but the journey was just beginning.